So with the slideshow that we're going to make, what is going to happen is we will have a basic collection of thumbnails. There's not a requirement for the thumbnails to all be the same size. And the finished images eventually won't all have to be the same size, but in the beginning they are, so that removes some of the challenge or difficulty from the work that we do. So right now, if I look at these pictures and put my mouse over it, we can see that an image title shows up, and that's the title attribute that's been applied to the image tag. Therefore, it gives the rollover effect on top of it. So not bad. Gives us some usability. But if I click, it just goes to a new page. So we can see it loads the file. So that's not really doing what we eventually want this to do. But if we look in the code, we will see that each image tag is wrapped in an anchor tag. So when I click on the image, the anchor tag sends me to that file. So it shows me that file. Now, one of the reasons why it's designed this way is if JavaScript is disabled, we still want the images to be able to be seen in their full size. So from a usability standpoint, it makes sense to have our code work when JavaScript is disabled. So when there's no script, and if I look at my JavaScript running on this page, we will see that all it has is the Jquery ubiquitous document ready function with nothing in it yet. And at that point, it's not doing anything. So our anchor tags are behaving as anchor tags want to do. I click on the picture, and it goes to the full-size version. Eventually, what we want to have happen is when I click on a picture, that it fades in the large picture and puts the text as a title at the bottom of the image. I have arrows with a nice little hover effect, and I can click on an arrow and it will bring me to the next picture. I can click on another one and it brings me to the next picture. Now you also notice that all of the pictures are scaled so that they're filling up the viewport up to 90% of their largest dimension, either vertically in this case, or on the previous picture horizontally. So it's filling it up at a 90% of the full. It's overlaid the image or the page with the black shadow, minimizing that so we can focus on the content of our large image. But if I click anywhere on the image or in that overlay, it fades out. It also happens that if I scroll the page, that overlay will stay on screen, which is nice. We're also going to be wanting it to be able to scale the artwork so that I can scale the artwork, or if I change my orientation, which is again a resizing kind of event, or not scale my artwork, scale my viewport. So if I'm resizing the viewport or changing orientation, which is a quasi viewport change, that the artwork is going to be scaled appropriately and not suddenly be too big or small. There are many slideshows that I have tried to use on my mobile device where the image then doesn't scale properly into the viewport and I can't navigate around the page. And if I turn my phone, it's now scaled incorrectly. I turn back, it doesn't rescale again, and now it's all totally hosed up. And then you can't get off of it, you can't get out of it, and it's broken. So what we're going to do is try to account for every possible use case where our slideshow could break and come up with a solution to solve that difficulty. But in the beginning, we're just going to work on overriding the default behavior of if I click on the link, it goes to that new file. Instead, we will hijack that and put the overlay and load the image on top. Then we'll add in some controls so we can navigate back and forth between the images. Then we will add in some information that will help to control scaling for horizontal and vertical images so that they will adequately fill our screen. And then we will worry about scrolling and resizing of the window. So all of these things are steps that we are going to incrementally add to our project as we go, and not try to solve everything all at the same time. Because when we do that, that's a recipe for failure. When we're working in Jquery, one of the things that we will want to do constantly is be looking at the API documentation. And the easy way then is just to do a search. Now, you can also just do a straight Google search where you just type in Jquery and then the thing you're looking for, and it will usually point you right to the documentation page, but it will also pull up a couple pages off of Stack Overflow. It may pull up some blog posts and other things. But if you can get it directly off the Jquery site and it gives you what you need to get going, I think that's a great place to begin with what we're doing. So I'm first going to look up ready. So now came up, and now I can scroll down and find ready. So if I look through the definition of ready and what is happening on ready, it's talking about how this function with Jquery, what it will do is it will load the page, and it will load a reference to all of the assets that have to be loaded, and then be able to start working with your page without having to load the assets in their entirety first. This makes it different than the straight JavaScript onload function, where we can tell our browser to not do anything until the page has loaded. If we put our script at the bottom of our markup in our HTML file, all of our assets will load before the JavaScript will try and do anything. If we have the JavaScript in our head, we have to wrap it into an onload function so that the page will load the assets first. Jquery's ready is a more advanced version where it will make a note of everything it's loading, and then it will start working on the page while it's simultaneously still gathering data for your image assets, font assets, or other media that's part of that page. So it's a more powerful version. And it's fairly standard, especially if you went through the Codecademy course, where you just have your ready function and then you put the contents of what you want to have happen inside of it. So all of your functionality for your page is inside between the curly braces of starting the ready function and ending it. Now, we will also, as we look at this, notice we see document.ready, and then we have parentheses, and inside of that I have function, parentheses, and curly braces. So this is what is called an anonymous function. An anonymous function is a function that doesn't have a name. We'll make plenty of named functions, but anonymous functions are functions we wish to execute and we don't have to reference them by name. With Jquery, we make a much greater frequency use of anonymous functions. So we will use Jquery methods that will then call anonymous functions. So we don't have to have the method call a named function. We can just put an anonymous function in that Jquery method, and that's considered good form with Jquery instead of making named functions. There will be times if we want to call the same function in multiple places that we then make a named function. And as we develop this lightbox, we will discover cases where we need to do that so we're not repeating our code. So moving from lightbox start, we're going to move into lightbox start 2. Now, a lot of the CSS we will go into later. It should be fairly straightforward when you look at what is contained within that CSS. There's not a lot of crazy things going on there. Are using the transform translate as a centering option, so we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that point. Now, one thing that Jquery is really good at doing is accessing elements in the DOM. So instead of having to use query selector or get element by tag name, get element by ID, or any of that stuff, we can just put the $sign, which then says, hey, Jquery, and then we specify what we're looking for. In this case, I'm going to ask Jquery to go find my div with the ID of slideshow. Actually, I don't even know that's a div. I just want whatever has an ID of slideshow, because that's what I'm asking for. And we can be more or less specific with Jquery. So we can just ask for that, or we could ask for it by div pound slideshow. So we have flexibility within how we call it. But Jquery is superb at grabbing assets on the page so that we're able to then work with them immediately. So that's probably one of the primary reasons that Jquery took off. Is in years past, using JavaScript to try and gain control of assets on the DOM was a huge pain in the butt, especially with each browser having different requirements or implementations of how you could access elements on the page. And Jquery takes care of all of the mess in the background of equalizing all the browsers, so you can just write one statement and it works. You don't have to do something for Internet Explorer than you would for Chrome, than you would for Safari. It's just one statement and it works. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is append. And append is a really powerful item inside Jquery. So when I look at append, and we look at this, the description, it tells us that it's going to insert that content to the end of the element that has been selected. So if we look at theirs, so it's now finding something with the class of inner and it's appending to it a paragraph. Well, that's easy enough. Now in our case, we can see that I am appending a div with no content. But that div has a class of overlay on it. Now it does make sense in this case to use a div because this is markup for presentation purposes only. It's not structural markup, it's not semantic markup. So using a div, this is a perfect use case of why I would use a div versus using any of the other newfangled HTML5 tags. So even though we keep hearing a lot of, well, you shouldn't use divs, you should use tags with meaning. But the caveat is, unless it's for presentational purposes only, in this case the black box that is going to show up on screen, it's visual, it has no other purpose. So if I look up overlay in my CSS, I will see it gets a height and width of 100%, background color of black at 60% opacity, and it's positioned absolutely at 0, 0. Going to comment out a line of code here, and now look at this page in the browser, hopefully. And you can see when the page shows up in the browser, we now have a box covering up everything. Now if I click on this, oh, there's code in there that's already making things happen. I forgot. I left code in there and haven't added it. Didn't talk about it. And this code here with the buttons, don't really need yet because we're not adding the buttons, so there's no reason for it to be there. I just forgot to delete it. Oops. We'll be adding to that in a little bit. So append adds an element to the markup. And looking at that markup, we can see what's there. If I look under elements, that here is that div that has been added. If I remove that statement and refresh the page, we'll see that there is no div down there. There is no overlay. So Jquery is adding to my HTML. It's creating a markup. Now, or a piece of structural markup. We could do that purely through JavaScript as well. So JavaScript has the ability to add content to the page. But once we've decided to deploy the Jquery library and use that in our project, it makes sense to take advantage of what it can do easier and faster than what we can write with vanilla JavaScript. So some of the code will be straight JavaScript, some of the code will be Jquery, and it's common that things mix and match and go back and forth. And you don't have to feel that, oh, I'm in Jquery, so I have to use Jquery when I could easily write a line of JavaScript instead. But often, once we're using Jquery, we will find that it's easier just to use it for doing most of our things. But the one thing to remember is Jquery is JavaScript. So to say that I'm writing Jquery instead of JavaScript, Jquery is JavaScript. It's just a library of JavaScript functions that we can then call without having to write out a bunch of lines of code. We can just reference those lines of code with one statement. That's really what Jquery does.
In other words,
thing to keep in mind when we're appending something, in this case, notice how I have single quotes around it. So then the element, if the element inside has or requires quotation marks, make sure that I am putting double quotes on that element, which does require it. So use single quotes out here. If I wanted to put double quotes around it, which Jquery is perfectly happy if you use single or double quotes, but it sometimes can get confused if you're nesting quotes. So you have to be careful with that. So that's where your nested quotes, then use all double quotes for the nested elements and single quotes for the outer set. And that will usually make things work nice for you. So that would be my recommendation on that point. Now if I turn on hide and save that, when I go back into Chrome and reload it, I can see the overlay is there, but we don't get to see it. It's not showing up. It's not causing difficulty because its display is set to none. So we've added an element, but we've turned off its display, which is how we want it to be, because we want that to show up once I click on an element. Now, I'm going to make a variable and call it image big. You can call it big image, but it refers to the large image that we are going to be putting on screen. By creating a variable for that, it's going to allow me to reference it in more functions, which as this project grows, that is going to be an issue, that we will have more functions that will need to be able to reference the large image. So if I defined it just in the place where I was using it, then I would have a hard time accessing it, or I would have to write other statements to access it later. So it's easy enough just to make a variable to store that reference. Now within Jquery, so if I just go Jquery show, it's going to bring me right into show. So we want to see what that's doing, and we can see how it's under effects. Now show is one of those nice items that is fairly easy to implement. We just do .show, and when we do that, we do have additional options where we can, after something shows, we could call it another function. So we can do some fancier kinds of things if we want to do it. So Jquery does excel at giving us some basic visual animation effects that coding directly in JavaScript get to be a little bit more complex or trickier. Now you'll notice that we have show, hide, and toggle. Now toggle is very similar to show and hide. It's just going to switch it. So if something is not showing, it will show it, and if it is showing, it will hide it. So toggle is a way of working around that. But show and hide are pretty much the same kind of thing. But we do have an option also. We can control the speed of it by putting in timing. We can see it's got a default of 400. So we can change that effect around if we want to do something so it slows it down or speeds it up. Just like we'll have fade in and fade out. We'll be looking at those. Those are very similar to show and hide, but by default they're an animated function, where show and hide just simply to change the CSS property of display. And boom, it's done. Now, with my pictures, when I click in my picture, I want the picture to show up. So in this case, I am accessing a paragraph that has the class of pic applied to it. So if I look, I have paragraphs with the class of pic that are the containers for my image with the anchor tag on it. That's just how the markup has been structured here. Wasn't required to put paragraphs around it. I could just have images, but by putting the paragraphs around it, it gives easier control of accessing them and messing with their CSS. The CSS is getting better that you could probably do without. We could just apply the class onto the thumbnail directly probably and rewrite the code, but we'll leave it as it is right now. So Jquery, grab all paragraphs with the class of pic and attach a click function to them. Now the click function, when we look at that, we will see in the click function what it does is it binds an event to the click JavaScript event for the trigger on an element. We have syntax for it. So it's a shortcut for the on-click and handler, which is the straight JavaScript way of doing things. So we can now specify the element, click, and then what we want to have happen. This is one of those instances where we will traditionally be using an anonymous function. So you can see how we have, if I change my line returns here a little bit, you'll see how there is this function right here that's contained inside of my click. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that that is happening when you work with Jquery. When you see curly brace, parentheses, semicolon at the end of everything, you're like, okay, what's that belong to? And it's really useful when you work in your code editor is you click after a piece of punctuation and you'll see that it underlines it, and it underlines its matched pair. So if I go to the parenthesis, I can see it goes to that parenthesis up there. So we use that as a guide to try and figure out what element is going with which item. So we can see as we look in our code how it puts the little green underline under elements that it is linking together. Now, one of the things that we need to do on this to make this happen is I'm going to comment out a line of code and we'll watch something happen. So if I click on the picture, we'll notice that it didn't quite work because my link is taking precedence over the click function on that paragraph. So the link is taking precedence. So we need to disable that. And the way that we're able to disable that is that we need to reference the event that occurred, and we'll just use E. So in our anonymous function, we put E, and then we tell E to prevent default. So what we're doing is we're telling the browser to ignore the default behavior for the anchor tag. So then it will do what I want to have happen instead of following what its default programming tells it to do. So when I restore that and refresh the page and click, oh, let's go back and now it's there. So by preventing the default, we're able to hijack the link and then get it to do our bidding instead of what the browser wants it to do. Once I have prevented the default behavior from occurring, the next thing we want to do is we want to find out what is the image file we were trying to load. So we need to gain access to the contents of the href. So when I look at that and look inside my code, we'll see that, okay, on the first picture that I clicked on, we have href, and it specifies the file we want to load. That's the big image we want to see show up on screen. So what we are doing here is we are gaining access to that path. So when I use the word this, that's now referring to the element that was clicked on. E is referring to the event of the click itself. So E is the click. This refers to what was clicked on. And then I am trying to look through any of its children for an anchor tag that has an attribute of href. Now there's a commented line above here that I will uncomment, and we'll look at that and see how both are a little bit different. Because either one of these lines, 122 or 123, will perform the same operation, we're going to look up what children does. So if I go into Jquery, look up children, it's a selector. Now, if you don't know what you're looking up, sometimes you can look on the side and you look through the different properties here to go, okay, what am I trying to find here? In this case, what I'm really doing is I'm looking for a selector. And I want a child selector, so I'm going to try to narrow it down. Now, in this case, what children does is it looks through the contents of the element that was selected, in this case, the paragraph with the class of pic. So this is now going to be paragraph with the class of pic, and it will look for any children that have an A tag and an attribute of href. But if I look at the markup, I will see that the only href in there anyway is on the anchor tag. So technically, I don't have to use the A to be more specific. I could just say I'm looking for the attribute of href and its value. But I don't have to reference that. I like having that A in there in my children statement because that tunes me in that I'm looking for an href that's part of an A. But I don't need it. It works identical both ways. If we look, it says get the children of each element of the matched elements optionally filtered by a selector. Okay. This is my optionally filtered by a selector. So it's grabbing children with an attribute of href, and it's grabbing the value of that href. That's what the ATTR stands for, is attribute. So in this case, in the example on Jquery, it grabs all level 2 ULs, children, and it applies a background color of red. So we can see as, where are we? So kids, target children. So then it's looking for specific elements and applying those values in. So as we work with the children tag, if we don't specify, it will just look through and grab any child that matches it. I like the A because it helps remind me of what I'm trying to do. But if I don't use it, there's only one href on those anchor tags anyway. So all paragraphs, class of pic, it looks for an anchor tag with an attribute of href, and it will set image path equal to that value. Now to verify that this is working, what we can do is do a lot of console.log statements. And I can now just log it out. Now if I do that, that now sends that message out. I just want to see if there's any other console things going on. Okay, we should be good. If I refresh the page and click, we can see now it grabbed the image path and said the image path is face 2. So we know that it's getting that value. Because when you start developing your project, you will try and store pieces of information, and then your code will break, or it won't be displaying what you want it to display. And you're like, what's going on? So the easiest way to reconcile that is to simply use a console statement where you say console log and whatever it is you think it's doing, and then you may find out that it's not getting the value you wanted. So then you have to change your code until you are able to achieve the value that you are aiming for. So once I have that path, I am going to now add to my markup a new image and give it a class of big. Now, just going to comment these lines out for now. If I go back into this page and reload it, if I click, I can say, OK, that's working. Now, if I reload, there's an overlay. We can click. Oh, I commented one too many lines out. And then we're going to append this markup, which is image source, image path class big to overlay. Overlay is not showing yet, but that's OK. Now if I look, I will see that that image is part of overlay. So it's added it to it. Refresh the page. There's no image there. Click. And we can see now there is. So Jquery is adding to it when I click. Now, if we add the image to the overlay, we assign a class to that image, or no, we say image big. We set our variable equal to image big, so we can reference it later. So we don't technically need that line now, but we will want that later on. So if you remember this variable image big here, we do want access to this later on. When we start putting in the arrow controls for going back and forth between our images, then we need access to it. And finally, once we know that we've done that, what we need to do is tell overlay to fade in. So when we fade in, we have access to slow. We have a whole bunch of other options under fade in. So we can go on our Jquery API, just type in fade in. Spell it right, that helps, but still I got lucky. Now you will notice there's a lot of options on fade in. All of these are properties that we can access with fade in. So we can find out, is the fade in complete? Did it fail? We can queue different things. We can apply easing. We can set a duration. So we have different options to work with. Fast and slow are easy ones, or we can put in a time duration of milliseconds. So we use 1,000 is 1 second. So we can use either a number or fast or slow. All right, apparently, oh, that's no, I thought those worked. Those are just pictures. Too bad. All right, so we can see it was hidden, it faded in slow. Now, when I look here, page, make sure you save first, otherwise it doesn't work. So I can click on the picture, click, it goes away. I can see fades in, fading it out. We just assign to overlay a function of clearing out the image. Now, technically, do I need to have that in its own function? Not now. I could have the contents of clear big as part of this overlay, click and make it go away. But later on, we will want to be able to reference making the overlay go away. And because of that, we will want to just have it in its own function so we don't have to update code in multiple places when it's the identical lines of code. So for now, we'll just accept that when we're clearing out big, tells the overlay to fade out, and then it removes big from overlay, and then it tells the overlay to hide itself so it's not there, because even if we fade it out, it's still present, because faded out doesn't say display none. Fading just changes our opacity, but things are still there. So we need to then hide it so it's no longer interfering with our clicking events, so we can then click on something else. That's why we want to put this line in place. Remove. Remove, it's an interesting jQuery statement. So when we remove something, it takes it out of the DOM, but so it will remove it from our document. But what is nice about the remove is it cleans it up so that we're able to then refresh that element later. Again, this is something we could do through straight JavaScript if we wanted, but it's not as neat and tidy as just specifying remove using the jQuery statement. So it's a much, as long as we're using jQuery, it makes sense to use it for as many things as it's good for, because it will generally speed up what we are trying to do. But everything you do in jQuery, you could do in pure JavaScript. It just would often take more lines of code to do so. But you should never feel that, oh, if I do it in jQuery, I couldn't do it in JavaScript. There's a way, you're just going to have to do some more looking on it. jQuery is widely accepted industry-wide. It's used in a very high percentage on the web. I can't remember the current stat at the moment. But JavaScript is increasingly gaining new functionality with each iteration and each browser update, removing the extreme dependence on jQuery that a lot of websites were starting to have, which is kind of cool that we can do a lot of it just through straight JavaScript. But when we have something like jQuery, it's useful to understand how to integrate it into our sites. To add the controls or the buttons in, which are really our controls, one thing that you will notice if you went and looked through the CSS, you'll notice that, okay, beyond our usual items of wildcard and H1 and paragraph, the nav slideshow, overlay, and big, we've used all of those. Pick, okay, we've used that. But then as we work our way down, left button and right button, and controls, and cap, which will be our caption. And you might read into that going, okay, font family, font size. So that kind of tells you that, maybe text is going to be part of this. So that makes sense for the caption, well, but we're not too worried about the caption, just getting the button showing up. So I have controls, and I have a left button and a right button. Now if I look at those buttons, we can see that they're using float as a way to position themselves on screen. Okay, that's good. They're probably going to be inside our controls, which will then be positioned on screen using the transform translate option. All right, so it's giving us some pointers of what we might want to name things as we put it in. And in the code that I forgot to delete, oops, we can see that there's an LB and right button. So to add in my controls, I start out, and what I can do is append on my overlay. So slideshow had overlay added to it, but the controls are really going to be part of the overlay because I want the controls to show up as part of this whole overlay debacle. So I say overlay append because we're adding to it, and then when I'm adding to it, then I can say div ID. Again, this is presentation markup, so there's no issues using a div. Controls, and then close div. So we've now added the controls to our document. Just going to put some spaces in here to make it a little easier to see. Now, to the controls, I want to add in my buttons. So using the same methodology, now I can reference my controls, append, and now as I append into it, it will be div ID equals LB. And I forgot my single quotes around that. Let me just highlight. Now, one thing when you're working in a code editor like this is if you want to put quotes, parentheses, double quotes, curly braces around something, you highlight it, type the character, and it will automatically put an opening and closing curly or punctuation mark around that entity. So now I've added in my left button. So I've appended my controls, and I will be repeating that again for my right button. So we tell Jquery, grab my controls, append, div ID equals RB, closing caret, open caret, div semicolon. So now that attaches the controls to my page. If I go back into my lightbox and refresh it, click on my element, we'll see that, okay, got something going on here. I mean, the controls aren't programmed to do anything yet, but yeah, we got something happening here. So I think we're now moving in the right direction. Can verify looking at my markup. We can see overlay has the controls. There are my buttons. So we can see that we've now added those div elements in. Now these controls,
you typed RD.
So fixing the typo with the controls, these controls currently don't have anything in them. Now, if we don't want to use an image for our control, we could use a character. And the common character we may want for a left button would be the caret, or the left angle less than sign. So we could put that in. If we look up an HTML escape code, we'll see that all of these different characters come up, and we can have our less than sign, our greater than sign, so LSAQUO, LSAQUO, or we can use ampersand pound 82050 and 82049, or 8249, sorry. So I could go ampersand pound 8249 semicolon, and this would be ampersand pound 8250 semicolon, and that puts in the escape character. And if I reload my page here, you will see under controls, we can see it's showing that character. If I click on something, very faintly they're showing up. They're small. If I look in the code, currently there's text commented out, which I'll bring that back because it's not using, we didn't load images. Now if we look, we can see, okay, there's the quotes. Now these current fields are set up and sized for using images, not using these less than and greater than sign arrows. But if you wanted to build your page with the arrows, so you're not loading additional image assets and you're just using characters, you could do that. Similar to using Font Awesome or some of these other kind of fancier glyph fonts, but that again would require you to load a separate font versus using something that's already inside the language. Now I'm going to put those out and replace it instead with images. So it'd be image source is equal to arrow left dot png, and on the other one replace it with image source is equal to arrow right dot png. Reload the page. We look at our controls. We can see it's now loading the different arrows. So we can see that in our elements. If I click, it puts the arrows on screen. Now the arrows don't have any cool rollover effects or anything else going on right now, but we can take care of that in JavaScript, which is kind of fun. Because with hover effects, we can set different hover effects. We could do this in the CSS. Or we can do it in the JavaScript here. So there would be an argument for having the pseudo element hover in our CSS and defining the background color of the image and then the background color when we roll over the image. But I chose instead to put it in using Jquery as a way to demonstrate how we can use the hover function. So it's kind of cool the way that we can do this inside of Jquery. So if I save that and go back to my page, now when it refreshes, we can see the hover's going on. And if I look in the markup, you'll see how the markup changes. So the background is changing. Remembering that the image itself, if you look close, it has a transparent pinkish background. So when it's over the dark, it's dark, but then when I roll over it, the background is then taking on a white instead of a black cast. But both are at 50%, so that combines with the inherent transparent background on the image, giving me the light pink or the dark red pink background. The hover function in Jquery accepts one or more parameters, so we can have it reference a function in and a function out, which is what I've chosen to do in this case. So with hover, you can see where it then declares this function, applies it to this. This again is the element that's being referenced. And we set the CSS property of background color to this new value. Setting CSS properties inside Jquery is very similar to doing it in JavaScript proper. But with the hover state, this function doesn't limit itself to just changing the CSS background color. I could have done any number of other things. And that's part of why I wanted to use hover here and show how we can now reference two separate functions. To get a little bit more about hover, we can search the API, look up hover, and we'll see how hover has different options of handler in, handler out. It also just has handler in out, so now it's going to be what is in on, it's essentially on mouse enter, on mouse leave, then at what function we want it to call. So we can see there's the slide function. Go to broccoli, it slides out green. Go to carrot, slides out orange, moves it. So we're able to use Jquery to do some pretty amazing things with very little code. We can select elements much easier and faster. We can apply different effects. So I could have done this in my CSS. There is a general stylistic and philosophical push to do as much as you can through CSS versus JavaScript or Jquery or any other method. It's viewed as that's often going to be your best way of going about doing things. There are specific kinds of things we can do in CSS, such as certain kinds of animation that will then take advantage of GPU or the graphics card processing that we can't get if we animate through Jquery or through JavaScript. So there are some things that if we use CSS as our tool of working, we will get better performance out of it. That's for visual effects, then that would be an argument to attempt to do that whenever possible. So now I've been able to add these elements onto my screen. We're able to make them show up, and we can get the rollover effects working with them. But what they're not doing yet is they're not selecting. If I click on them, they're not going anywhere. All we have on them right now is the hover effect. We look at moving forward, we need to continually kind of look back at what we know and what we've already done, because that is going to be important. Now currently we have it set up. If I click on a picture, it's now giving me access to the path of that picture. But what I want to happen is that once I have access to that picture, I want to be able to click on an arrow and it now goes to the next picture, if there is one. If not, then I want it to fade away. So I need to somehow make my arrow know whether there is another picture, and if so, what picture to go to. So we need to somehow teach our button arrows to be smart. Now we will worry about getting the arrows to move away from the center of the face and deal with all of that later. We're not too concerned about it because we want to get functional working before pretty or presentational. Now if I do click on these, it is kind of fun. We can see here is the item, and if you watch under display, it gives an interesting option. So if I click anywhere, watch what happens to the screen up here. And you can see how the opacity fades out before it moves to display none. So that's kind of a cool feature of Jquery, the way that fade out just pulls the opacity down and then it switches it to display none. So it's a neat option. We can see where it comes up and where it goes away as part of it. So the opacity goes up, opacity goes down. So that looking at our elements inside our developer tools of our browser is a really useful way of understanding what is happening in our project beyond just simply putting in the code going, hey, it worked, hey, it didn't. Use the tools that are there to solve problems. So when you're working, if things aren't showing up, look up under the elements. Did they get properly added to your page? If not, you can start to track that down. If your JavaScript just plain stops working and you get back to where when you click on a picture it goes to the picture itself and doesn't pull up the overlay, check out the console and chances are you'll see an error message in the JavaScript, because when the JavaScript breaks, it breaks 100%. There's no sliding scale of brokenness in JavaScript. So if I just put one error message in my JavaScript and refresh my page, we can see, well, there's an error message, but if I click and the image shows up instead of behaving properly, I know something is broken. And when that occurs, we can use the console to fix it, because the console in the previous page, it told us there was something wrong. But if I don't have that up, so if I'm just looking at the page and it's broken, refresh it, click, okay, we know it didn't work, so now we have to figure out why. Pull up the console, and we'll see, oh look, there's an error. It's at line 121. Go in my code, line 121. Oh look, there's a space that's not supposed to be there. Fix it, go back, refresh the page, it works. So we want to use that as a way of tracking what we are doing. That's going to make things work more effectively for us. Now the next section that we're going to do is to add some intelligence to the arrows so that we can click on them and make something happen. Now the finished version of making the arrows have some intelligence is in Lightbox Start 3. So you can cheat and look ahead if you want, but I'm going to slowly start adding the bits of code in and explaining them as we go to make sense with it versus just dumping up the finished code. But know that if yours is broken, you can find all the answers in this file, and that gives you something to work with. So know that it is there, and you can look ahead if you want to peek. That's okay. I'm not offended. Maybe a little bit. Our buttons have been added. The hover effects have been added. Image big is there waiting for something to happen. When I click on it, something will happen. But in the meantime, before we do that, what we want to do is we want to gather up and store all of the images that are going to be loaded. But we're not storing the images themselves. We're just going to store their URL, their path, so that image path. So I am going to create an array to store that list of paths. So I will say var path list is equal to, and now it's, whoop, wrong, just square brackets. Square brackets are how we construct an array. So now I have an empty array to store my paths in. Now what I also want to know is I want to know how many images I will be putting into this array. So var total images will be equal to, and this is where Jquery comes to the rescue. And I will say in my slideshow, I'll say how many items have a class of pick on them. So when I reference something in Jquery, that reference to elements, I can say how many. And we're able to use our array method of count, or I mean of length, sorry. in some languages, when we want to know how many items there are, we may use a method of count. Sometimes we will use length. So it varies by context and language. You will find that sometimes when you're coding, you'll type in length and it's not working because you were supposed to use count. You'll type in count, it's not working because you were supposed to use the length. Every coding language will have its own idiosyncrasies around the concept of how many items exist in this collection of things. And count and length are two common words that have a similar functionality when we are coding. So that will now return how many are there. So just to verify, and this is really when you are trying to figure something out like this. So what I want to do is I want to say how many images are there, and then I want to store each URL in this array. So in this case, I would have 3 because there's 3 items with the class of pick, and I will notice that I am going to look at the hrefs and say, okay, what are the hrefs? And I'll put face JPEG, face 2 JPEG, and face 3 JPEG into my array of pictures. So that's what I'm going to put into it. So when we're figuring things out like this and making it up as you go, and you're not sure, you're like, okay, is this giving me the value I want? What I can do is just log it out. So I will say total images. Total images. So if I log that out right now, that's going to put something in my console, a piece of information that I can use to go, hey, is this working? Is this giving me what I want to know? And if I refresh the page, we'll see that it says total images 3. Perfect. It works. So when developing or reverse engineering from a concept of you know your destination, you don't know quite how you're going to get there. Every time you add something in and you want to know, is it giving you the result that you want, log it out and see what it says. And if it gives you something different than you were expecting, that's a pretty strong indication that you need to try a different plan of attack. So now I can log out my images. And now I'm going to populate path list. For this, we can use a for loop. So var I is equal to 0, I is less than total images, I plus plus. So standard for loop that you've typed 1,000 times. I hope you've done 1,000 for loops by now. In our for loop, we'll say path list, and we'll just reference. Now remembering arrays start counting from 0, so I starts at 0, so we'll say the first item in our path list is going to be equal to, and now this is where it's going to get a little bit iffy. I'm going to say it's equal to something. We'll figure out what that something is in a little bit. And it's that something's attribute of href. So it's very similar to what we did inside the click function where we grabbed the href. But this time we're going to need to access it a little bit differently. So this is where we're trying to get that particular something. And I know that doesn't belong there, that will be there, so it will be ending like this. Now this something that we're trying to gain access to, we're going to use a particular method of selection in Jquery that allows us to go through. So we will, because what we want to say is, I want to grab all of the anchors inside of slideshow, but I want to grab them in order. So if I say give me the anchor tags in slideshow, well, that's all of them. But I want to say, well, give me the first one when you go through slideshow. So if I look at slideshow, give me the first anchor tag, then give me the second one, then give me the third one. So to do that, Jquery has a cool feature for doing selections. So again, this is now under selectors that we're working with. And what it is going to be, let's see if I can, that's, no, okay. I was hoping I didn't have to scroll through all of it. But it's the EQ method. So it reduces the set of matched up elements to the one at the specified index. So if we look at, if I had a list item, a bunch of lists, this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 items, we start counting at 0. So if I say, give me the list item at 2. If I look down here, give me the list item at 2. 0, 1, 2. So knowing that EQ says we're looking for divs, and then give me the second div, 1, 2. I thought we got a visual with that, but we don't. So we're looking for that particular element. So now, looking at my code here, under my something, so what we want to know is inside slideshow, I want anchor tags. So the anchor tag at, but now here what we are trying to find is at the position, the current position. In this case it would be I. And this almost works except that we need to escape. We need to escape from, because I is essentially a number. But if I say I, it says, hey, look for the letter I, but the letter I isn't a number. Because the letter I isn't a number, we want I when it's our counter variable. So our syntax is going to be slightly ugly here. So what we can do is we say slideshow, anchor tags, and then we want the item at position I, and then we can get our closing curly brace by having single quotes around that again. So it's not the prettiest looking thing, but it gives us the functionality of being able to select our anchor tags in numerical order and access their href attribute. To verify it's working, so I will log this out. All right. So apparently in Atom, if I just type in log, that's going to give me what I need. I was wondering, I hadn't got that shortcut to show up before. So just log out path list. So let's log out this path list, except I need to capitalize it there. Make sure they're all capped properly. Save. Refresh my page, and we can see path list, phase 2, and phase 3. So we've now proven we can count how many images, and we can grab our path list. One item that we are going to need shortly is we will need to know what is our current image number. We won't give it a value yet. We'll give it a value when we actually need it, but we need to be able to store this, and we need to store this value outside of the functions that are going to use it, because more than one function will need access to the current image number. Because of that, we need to store the value outside of any one function. We have access to our images, or their hrefs, their paths. We can click on an image, we can get a big image to show up. So now what we need to think about putting in is putting in our ending, or another ending, our code for each one of our buttons. Before we do that, I just want to point out one thing that's a good idea to do is you will notice in the code provided at most closing tags, specifically function closing tags, well, more than a single line function like this, I've been putting in comment after the closing brace to help define what item that particular brace goes with. It makes it easier when you are reading through your code, so you know that this parenthesis goes with that element there. This goes with this item up here. This curly is going to then belong with this curly up here. So we start to trace those elements around. It makes our lives easier to keep track of the opening and closing elements. So this one, as I had to look for it, I really should then put in a comment here and go and click function. So it would just be useful at all of your closing punctuation to put in a comment to add to the legibility of your code. Because when you start putting things on screen, and now we have functions inside of functions, because all of our code so far is inside our document ready function. So now we have a bunch of functions inside another function. JavaScript's okay with that. Not all languages are. We just have to learn how to accept that and roll forward with it. To add functionality to our button, adding in for the button, we'll work on the left button first. So what we will do is we'll add in a click method and then call an anonymous function with it. Now remember, as we're working in jQuery, that curly brace goes with the function, the parenthesis goes with the click, and because it's technically a single line statement, we should have a semicolon after that. And I'll add in a comment and left click. Now to figure out what left click needs to do, what we want to start with is going to say, as a standard measure when we are coding in for functionality, is we'll start out with prevent default. So we just begin with that as just, that's a prophylactic measure that keeps things safe. So we'll start with that. Now, we want to set our current image number, which is going to be whatever image we are currently on. So we'll set current image number equal to, and this is where we can use a method that we used previously on the prior project, which was index of. Because we used index of on the Electric Dreams project to find out, did a word exist in our array of words? And before we were just checking to go, did it exist? If so, it returned a number. We didn't care what that number was. We just wanted to know, did it exist there? Because if not, then it would be equal to -1, meaning the word wasn't anywhere to be found. In this case, we know, if we're seeing these buttons, we know that the image is on screen. Because we know the image is on screen, we're going to go into the path list, and we will use index of, and now we're going to find the index of our image big, and we're going to then grab its attribute of source. So what this does is it now finds out and says, okay, if we see an image on screen, what is its position in that array of paths? So to find out if this is working or generating anything of value, what we can do is log that out, and test. Test early, test often. That will keep you safe when you are coding. So now if I click on this and click on the left button, it should say current image number is 1. Recognizing my first image is 0, my next one is 1, the third one will be 2. Try again. Click the left arrow. Current image 0. Try again. Current image 2. Perfect. All right. Now, you may have noticed when I clicked on the image, it made the big picture go away still. Or when I clicked on the arrow, the big one still goes away. Because one thing that happens with click events is they work their way down through the DOM hierarchy. So when I click on something, it works its way down and bubbles back up. So even if we get this image loading the next image and trying to show the next image on screen, it's still, overlay is still going to register that, hey, someone clicked on me, and it's going to make everything go away, and all of our hard work will be in vain. And it'll be like, oh, crap, that sucks. So we need to do something about that. And there's a method that we have access to called stop propagation. And what that does is that now takes the event. So this button, when I click on it, it's going to stop that message of, hey, a click happened, as in wants to travel through my DOM hierarchy, and it stops it from progressing any further. So we say e.stop propagation and throw some parentheses on because it's a function or method. Now if I refresh the page and click, now we can see it works. Click on the next one, click. Now it doesn't make it go away. So stop propagation will be your friend. That's how we can make that work. Now, this returned the value of the current image. Now, what I want to do is I want to change what is the current image. So if I hit the left arrow, I want the current image to go down by 1. So we can simply say current image number minus minus. And that takes 1 away from it. Now if I take 1 away from it, at this point, we're going to have to be careful because we don't want to go too far down, but we'll worry about that in a moment. First, let's just see if we can change how it's displaying on screen. Then we will figure out how to make sure it doesn't go too far into the hole. So what I can do is I can now specify my image big. I want image big to have its attribute of source changed. And I'm going to set it equal to path list. And then I'm going to access in my path list array, so I use square brackets, my current image number. So I'm taking image big, I'm setting its attribute of source equal to the current image number. So if we remember, it logged out my current image number of whatever the current big image is on screen. Now I make current image number go down by 1, and then I change the source of image big to that updated or new image number. So we can save, go into the browser, refresh the page, and I'll start out on number 3, and I'll click, and we'll see it change to number 2. Click again, changes to number 1. Now if I click again, nothing's happening because there's no more images to go to. Now, moving forward with it, as we want to then only update the path when it makes sense to do so. So we need to wrap it into a conditional. So doing that, it would be if current image number, and we have different ways that we can go about doing it, but an easy one, because you can always write your conditionals in either direction. I'm just going to go in this direction because it works for me. So as long as my current image number is greater than or equal to 0, then I want to update my path. But if it's not greater than 0, meaning it's at a negative number, then we'll say else. And under the else, then I will call clear big, which we had defined earlier at the very beginning down at the bottom. To verify if it's working, we will test. So again, if current image number is greater than or equal to 0, we update the path. Otherwise, we make it go away. Looking at the paths here, I'll click on the first one. We'll click on the next, click on the next, and now not working yet. So with the page properly refreshed, click on 3, goes down, down. So if I click here, click the button, it goes away, so it's working. So I must not have refreshed the page. The wrong window was active when I hit page refresh. So now we can see that the left button is working. The right button is going to be very similar. So with the right button, change L to an R. Current image number needs to go up. But then we need to set something. Instead of going down to 0, we care about our total number of images. If we remember way back up top here, we had total images. We found that for a reason, not just to use it in our array or our for loop, but also with the right button, we're going to care about total images. So as long as our current image number is less than total images. Now remember, total images in this instance is 3. Current image number should be 0, 1, or 2. So if current image number is 2, it will update it. Then the next time I click, current image number goes up, becomes 3. 3 is no longer less than total images, so it should make it go away. So just changing that one line in our conditional, changing the minuses to pluses. If I refresh my page, I'll click on the first image, click on the right button, click, it goes away. So now we're able to make both of the buttons work, and when I get to the end of the line, the slideshow disappears.